The bitter winter wind howled through the desolate peaks like a living thing, hungry, relentless, unforgiving. Snow spiraled in violent gusts across the jagged mountainside, swallowing the last traces of warmth from a sky that had long forgotten the sun. She stood against it all. Lyrith's white hair lashed around her face, her dark fur-accented armor catching the bite of the storm as she braced against the weight of the man slumped against her side. Her jaw was set, her eyes, steady, clear, held something that had no business being there after everything he had done to her. Compassion. Ashlorn's massive frame sagged, his once proud, wolf-like features carved hollow by exhaustion and something rawer than physical pain. Regret. The Alpha King who had looked at her like she was nothing, who had cast her into the frozen wastes with nothing but her pride and the cold at her back. Those glowing yellow eyes that had once surveyed kingdoms without flinching, flickered now like embers drowning in ash. And she had come for him anyway. Not because she had forgiven him, not because the wound had healed, but because when the darkness descended and everyone else turned away, something in her refused to leave him to die in it alone. She tightened her grip around him, steadying them both against the howling wind. Would you sacrifice everything for someone who once rejected you? How far would you go for someone who once broke you? If this story hit home, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. We can't reach 1,000 subscribers without you. Years ago, the word had fallen like an axe. Rejected. Lyrith had stood in the center of the pack circle, the mountain wind threading through her white hair, her chin lifted even as her chest caved inward. Around her, faces she had known since childhood turned away, one by one, like candles being snuffed out. No one met her eyes. No one spoke in her defense. The silence was its own kind of cruelty. And at the front of it all stood Ashlorn. He was impossible to ignore, towering, broad-shouldered, wrapped in dark fur-lined armor that made him look like the mountain itself had taken human form. His pointed ears were sharp against the gray sky. His yellow eyes, cold and utterly unreadable, swept over her once, just once, the way a king surveys something inconvenient before having it removed. He didn't flinch, he didn't hesitate. You are not fit for this pack. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Final, irrevocable. Leave. That was all she was worth to him. A single sentence. The title they gave her, Rejected Omega, wasn't just a label, it was a sentence of its own kind. In their world, rank was survival, power was protection, and without either, the wilderness didn't ask questions before it consumed you. The mountains had swallowed stronger wolves than her. She walked out with nothing. The first nights were the worst. The cold pressed in from every direction, seeping through her armor, curling around her bones like it intended to stay forever. She built fires that the wind killed. She found shelter that the snow buried. She hunted alone, slept alone, and woke each morning to the specific kind of silence that only the truly abandoned ever learn to recognize. But she didn't die. That had surprised even her. What threatened to break her wasn't the frost or the hunger or the isolation. It was the quieter devastation of being deemed not enough, not strong enough, not worthy enough. By him, by all of them. That rejection lived beneath her skin long after her wounds healed, a splinter too deep to reach, too stubborn to dissolve. Ashlorn remained in her mind not as a villain, but as something more insidious, a cold, unfeeling ruler who looked at her suffering and felt absolutely nothing. A man so encased in power and pride that compassion had no door to enter through. She survived the wilderness. She was less certain she had survived him.
But survival has a way of hardening what rejection tries to destroy. And somewhere in those long, brutal winters alone, Lyrith began to understand something the pack had never taught her. She didn't need them to believe in her. She only needed herself.
The rumor arrived on the lips of a half-frozen traveler who stumbled past her ridge camp just before dusk. Lyrith almost didn't stop him. She had learned, in her years of solitude, to keep her head down and her questions few. Other people's storms were not hers to walk into. She had enough weather of her own. But something in the traveler's wild eyes and ragged breath made her hand shoot out before her mind could stop it, pulling him under the shelter of her overhang. The words spilled out of him in fragments. An ambush, rogue shifters moving through the high passes like smoke. No warning, no mercy. Ashlorn's pack scattered. The Alpha King himself driven into the upper blizzard peaks, hunted by something the traveler could barely describe. Ethereal shapes, he said, wolf forms made of storm and shadow, drawn to power like predators to blood. The traveler warmed himself by her fire and moved on before nightfall. Lyrith sat very still for a long time. She owed Ashlorn nothing. That truth was clean and simple, and she had carried it close for years, polishing it smooth like a stone, a reminder on the days when old wounds ached and she was tempted toward bitterness. She owed him nothing. He had taken everything she had trusted him with and discarded it without ceremony. And yet, the pull was not about him. That was what she had to understand, sitting there with the fire guttering and the wind screaming down from the peaks. It was not forgiveness. It was not love rekindled from ashes. It was something older and quieter inside her, a refusal to become the kind of person who walks away when walking away means death for someone else, even him. Especially him, perhaps, because it would have been so easy. She was afraid. She didn't pretend otherwise, even to herself. The upper peaks in a blizzard were a death sentence without the ethereal hunters factoring in. And there was another fear beneath that one, more shameful and more honest, the fear that she would find him, risk everything, and he would look at her the way he had in that pack circle, like she was nothing, like her sacrifice didn't even register. That fear almost held her feet to the ground. Almost. She pulled on her armor in the dark, methodical and quiet, the way she had learned to do everything out here, without ceremony, without witnesses. She checked her blade, her pack, the faint trail markers she'd memorized from years of navigating these ridges alone. Then she stepped out into the snow. The cold hit her like a wall. The wind pushed back, as if warning her. She walked forward anyway. Some choices don't announce themselves as brave. They simply happen, one foot, then the other, into the dark. She moved through the lower forest like a shadow herself. The pines closed around her quickly, their branches heavy and bowed under the accumulated weight of days of snowfall. What little light remained bled out of the sky fast up here, the clouds pressing down thick and purposeful, and within the first hour the world had narrowed to the gray-white ground beneath her boots and the pale glow of snow reflecting back against the dark. She kept her pace steady, measured. Panic burned energy. Panic got people killed. But she felt the eyes before she saw them. They appeared gradually, amber glints between the tree trunks, low to the ground and utterly still. One pair, then three, then too many to count comfortably, arranged at the edges of her peripheral vision with the patient, assessing stillness of things that were not afraid of her. She kept her hand loose near her blade and her gaze forward, refusing to stop, refusing to run. Predators understood hesitation. They fed on it. She walked through their watching like it was nothing. It cost her more than she showed. The first river crossing came an hour into the ascent, a churning black slash through the snow where the current ran too fast to freeze properly. She found the shallowest crossing and went through it without stopping to think, the water hitting her boots and shins like a physical blow, cold so absolute it briefly stole her breath entirely. She came out the other side gasping, kept moving, let the exertion of the climb begin to pull warmth back into her legs before the cold could settle in and own them. The cliffs came next. They rose out of the slope without warning, jagged and dark against the white, offering handholds that were half buried in ice. She climbed with a methodical focus of someone who understood that the mountain did not care about her. It was not cruel, it was simply indifferent, and indifference at altitude was just as lethal as any enemy. She tested each grip before committing her weight. She moved slowly where she wanted to move fast. She moved fast where the wind tried to peel her off the rock face entirely. At the top, she allowed herself 10 seconds, just 10. She stood at the ridge's edge and looked out at the peaks above, white and vast and howling, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was walking into. Then she turned and kept climbing. With every step the cold deepened, and with every step something else deepened alongside it, something she hadn't expected to find out here. Not rage, not grief, not the old bruised ache of rejection. Purpose, clean and uncomplicated and entirely her own, not given by a pack, not validated by an alpha king, forged, quietly and completely, by herself. She heard him before she saw him, a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a groan, carried down through the howling wind, and Lyrith followed it through the last stretch of ridge to a natural hollow carved into the cliff face. The scene stopped her for half a breath. Ashlorn was on one knee. That alone told her everything about how bad it was. This was not a man who knelt. His dark armor was torn across the shoulder, a deep wound bleeding sluggishly beneath the fur lining, and his massive frame was hunched with the particular stillness of someone conserving what little strength remained. His yellow eyes were up, tracking, but the sharpness in them had dulled to something rawer. Around him, 4 ethereal wolves circled. They were wrong in the way that only unnatural things can be, wolf-shaped but translucent, their bodies flickering at the edges like smoke that hadn't decided what it wanted to be. They moved without sound, without breath, their pale eyes fixed on the wounded alpha with the absolute patience of things that knew they had already won. Lyrith didn't announce herself. She dropped into the hollow from above, blade drawn, landing between Ashlorn and the nearest spirit in one fluid movement. The creature recoiled. They always hesitated at the unexpected, and she used that half-second ruthlessly. She drove forward, fast and low, her agility doing what brute strength couldn't against something that had no solid body to wound in conventional ways. She had spent years learning the wilderness alone. She knew how to fight things that didn't fight fairly. She pushed them back through motion and disruption, never giving them the stillness they needed to press their advantage, until one by one the ethereal shapes frayed at their edges and dissolved into the blizzard wind like they had never been. The hollow went quiet. She stood in the silence, breathing hard, and turned to face him. Ashlorn had risen to his full height, wounded, blood darkening the fur at his shoulder, and still, despite everything, carrying himself like a king surveying a border dispute. His yellow eyes moved over her slowly. Something shifted in them that she couldn't quite name before it was buried under the familiar coldness. He said nothing for a long moment. "You shouldn't be here," he said, finally. His voice was low, controlled, offering nothing. Lyrith looked at him steadily. The wind filled the space between them, cold and indifferent. "You're welcome," she said. No gratitude crossed his face, no acknowledgement of what she had walked through to reach him. His jaw tightened, pride, suspicion, something fractured beneath both, and he looked away from her as if the admission of debt was a wound worse than the one bleeding at his shoulder. Some things, she thought, hadn't changed at all. The cave was shallow but sufficient, a wound in the cliff face just deep enough to block the worst of the wind, its stone walls holding a faint memory of warmth that a small fire could coax back to life. Lavrith built it without asking for his help. Ashlorn settled against the far wall with the careful, controlled movement of someone determined not to show how much pain they were in. He watched her work, gathering what little dried tinder the cave offered, striking the flame with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this alone 100 times, and said nothing. She let the silence be what it was. When the fire caught and steadied, she moved to him with her pack open, pulling out the small kid she had carried through frozen rivers and up ice-slicked cliffs without complaint. She didn't ask permission, she simply knelt beside him and began assessing the damage with careful, methodical hands. He went rigid at the first touch. "Hold still," she said, quietly, without cruelty. He held still. The wound was deep but clean, a spirit's doing, which meant it wouldn't fester in the way of ordinary wounds, but it would drain him faster if left untended. She worked with focused, unhurried attention, and somewhere in the middle of it she became aware that he was watching her, not with suspicion this time, with something less guarded and more unsettling. She kept her eyes on her work. The firelight moved through her white hair and threw soft shadows across the cave walls, and the storm outside pressed its noise against everything, and for a long stretch of time there was only the sound of wind and the quiet business of care being given to someone who hadn't earned it. "Why?" His voice came low, stripped of its usual authority, almost unfamiliar. Layrith tied off the last binding and sat back on her heels. She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. "After what I—" "Yes," she said, "after that." She looked at him then, directly, and whatever he found in her eyes seemed to cost him something. His jaw worked. The coldness he wore like armor showed its first real crack, not gone, not surrendered, but fractured enough that she could see what lived behind it, something old and heavy and lonelier than she had expected. She recognized it because she knew it herself. She turned back to the fire and fed it another piece of wood, giving him the privacy of not being watched while he found his way back to steadiness. Some things couldn't be rushed, but something had shifted in the cave's small warmth, quiet, fragile, and undeniable. Do you think you could trust someone who once rejected you? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. They descended through the gray morning in silence, picking their way across the ice-bound ridge with the careful rhythm of two people who had not yet agreed on what they were to each other. Lyrith kept her eyes on the trail. The path down was treacherous in ways the climb hadn't been. Every step required attention, and attention was useful, because attention kept her from thinking too clearly about the man moving through the snow beside her. She was thinking anyway. It had been easier, she realized, to come for him when he was a problem to be solved, a wounded man, a surrounded man, someone in need of the particular set of skills she had spent years acquiring in the cold places he had sent her to. That she could do, action stripped clean of feeling, purpose without complication. This was different. This was walking beside him in the quiet aftermath, close enough to hear his breathing slow and careful against the altitude, close enough to be aware of him in ways she didn't want to examine. The pull was infuriating. She had thought, she had believed, that enough winters alone could erode almost anything, that the distance she'd built was structural now, load-bearing. Apparently not. She told herself what she knew to be true. The mountains would end. The snow would thin. He would return to his throne and his pack and the world that had always belonged to him, and she would return to the clean, honest solitude that asked nothing of her and broke nothing in her. This moment was not a beginning. It was an aberration, an act of conscience that she would not allow herself to mistake for anything more. She almost believed it. Beside her, Ashlorn moved through his own private war with the grimness of a man losing it. Every step sent a dull reminder up through his wounded shoulder, and he welcomed it. It was concrete, manageable, something he could set his jaw against. The other pain had no such clean edges. It lived in the image of her in that hollow, blade already drawn, already between him and the dark, already there, when no one else had been, when he had given her every reason in the world not to be. He had misjudged her. The understanding wasn't new, it had arrived somewhere in the cave's firelit quiet while she dressed his wound with hands that held no malice, but it was still arriving in waves, each one worse than the last. He had looked at her once and seen an inconvenience, a variable to be removed from an equation he hadn't cared to solve properly. And she had looked at him, left for dead in a blizzard, and come anyway. His pride offered its usual defenses. He let them rise and fall without following them. What remained after was something unfamiliar and unarmored. Shame. And beneath it, quieter and more dangerous, want. Not for her deference, not for her gratitude. For her to look at him like he was worth the walk she had made. He wasn't sure he had ever wanted anything he deserved less. The tree line appeared below them like a promise. Dark pines cutting up through the white, the suggestion of lower ground and breathable air and the distant possibility of warmth. Lyrath had just allowed herself to feel the first loosening of tension in her shoulders when the temperature dropped. Not the ordinary cold of altitude, something else. A wrongness in the air that she recognized from the hollow, that particular quality of stillness that preceded things that had no business existing. She stopped walking. Ashlorn stopped a half step later, his instincts still sharp beneath the exhaustion. She heard him draw breath. It came from the slope above, not circling this time, not patient, done waiting. The shape that descended through the blizzard was larger than the others had been, wrong in scale the way a nightmare distorts familiar things, its translucent body flickering with a darkness at its core that the others hadn't carried. The alpha of them. She understood that immediately and completely. It wasn't looking at her. Its pale eyes were fixed entirely on Ashlorn. She felt him shift his weight beside her, preparing, despite everything, to meet it. Wounded shoulder, drained reserves, 2 days of altitude and blood loss behind him. She did the math without meaning to. It was the kind of calculation that had kept her alive for years in the wilderness, fast and unsentimental. He wouldn't survive the first strike. The creature gathered itself. She didn't decide. There wasn't time for decision. There was only the space between one moment and the next, and her body already moving through it, stepping forward and across, putting herself between Ashlorn and the descending dark. The impact was extraordinary. It hit her like the mountain itself had swung. She felt something give along her left side, the cold vanishing briefly beneath a heat that had no business existing in this air, and then the ground came up to meet her, and she was on her knees in the snow with the world tilting badly at its edges. She heard him. The sound Ashlorn made was not a word. It wasn't the controlled authority of a king or the cold distance of a man armored in pride. It was something from beneath all of that, raw and ragged and entirely unguarded, fury and grief arriving simultaneously in a single roar that seemed to reshape the air around it. What followed was brief. When it was over, she felt his hands before she saw him, large and careful and shaking slightly in ways she suspected he didn't know, pulling her against his chest with a desperation that had no performance in it. His arms closed around her like he intended to hold the warmth in by force. "Stay," he said against her hair, just that, stripped of everything else. She became aware, distantly, that he was trembling. The great Alpha King, kneeling in the snow, holding her like losing her would undo something in him that couldn't be rebuilt. Perhaps it would. The snow kept falling. It fell on her upturned face and on his bent shoulders and on the dark fur of his armor, indifferent and soft, the blizzard gentling now as if the worst of it had spent itself along with the creature that lay dissolved into nothing at the ridge's edge. Ashlorn didn't move. He held her against his chest with both arms, and his cheek pressed to her hair, and his breathing ragged in a way she had never heard from him, had never imagined hearing, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he broke.
It happened quietly, the way the most profound things do, not all at once, but in increments, a sound low in his throat, a tightening of his arms around her, and then words coming up from somewhere so far beneath his usual self that she barely recognized his voice. I was wrong. Rough, unsteady. About all of it. About you. She was still, listening. I looked at you and I saw, I don't know what I saw, something that frightened me, perhaps, something I didn't have the courage to understand. A breath, fractured at its edges. So I discarded it. I told myself it was strength. It was the most cowardly thing I have ever done. She felt the words land in her chest one by one, finding the old wound with unerring accuracy, pressing into it, not cruelly, but the way pressure is sometimes applied to heal. I love you. His voice cracked on it, simply and completely cracked, and he didn't try to recover the pieces. I think I have for longer than I am capable of admitting, and I sent you into the cold instead of admitting it, and now you came back for me anyway, and now you're... He stopped. His arms tightened further. Please, he said. Just that. Lyrith opened her eyes. He was looking down at her, and his yellow eyes, those cold, unreadable eyes that had once swept over her like she was nothing, were luminous with something that had no armor left around it. Tears had cut clear lines through the cold on his rugged face. He wasn't trying to hide them. He was simply there, fully and entirely, in a way she had not known him capable of, and something in her, something that had been braced for years against the particular pain of being deemed not enough, released its held breath. Not because he had said the right words, not because the wound vanished, but because she saw herself suddenly and clearly through the ruin of his composure, what it had cost him to reach her, what she had been worth to him even when he'd been too broken to know it, what she had always been worth. The cold didn't touch her the same way after that. She reached up and pressed her hand against his jaw, steady and certain. I know, she said softly, and she meant more by it than forgiveness. She meant that she finally, completely knew.
The lights came without warning. They appeared above the peaks in slow, unfurling ribbons, pale green and silver, moving through the dark sky with a quiet authority that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with something older than either of them. Lyrith had seen the northern lights before, alone on ridge camps in the deep of winter, and they had always struck her as beautiful in the distant way of things that existed entirely apart from human suffering. These felt different. These felt intentional. She became aware, gradually, that the pain in her side had changed, not gone, but altered, as if something external had taken an interest in it. Ashlorn's arms were still around her, and the warmth he was putting into holding her had a quality she couldn't explain clinically, something that moved through her like a current finding a path it had always been meant to travel. She sat up slowly. He helped her without being asked, without making it smaller than it was. They looked at each other in the light from the sky. She understood it in the same moment she saw it in his face, the recognition arriving not as surprise, but as the particular feeling of a thing that has always been true, finally being spoken aloud. Fated. The word existed in their world the way gravity existed, not as mythology, but as mechanism, a pairing written into the architecture of things before either party had any say in the matter. It explained the pole she had never been able to fully dissolve. It explained why she had walked into the blizzard when every reasonable part of her had argued against it. It did not explain away the pain. She was clear-eyed enough to know that fate was not absolution. It was not an erasure of what had been done or what had been survived, but it reframed the distance between them as something they had been moving across all along, toward this exact point. Ashlorn shifted, and then, slowly, deliberately, with full understanding of what the gesture meant, he bowed his head to her. Not a king's acknowledgement, not condescension wearing a softer coat, a genuine and unguarded bow, offered from his knees in the bloodied snow to a woman he had once called unworthy. "My equal," he said, "if you'll have me." Lyrith looked at him for a long, quiet moment, then she reached out and took his hand. "Get up," she said gently. "We have a pack to return to." He rose. They stood together under the slow movement of light across the winter sky, bound by something that had survived rejection and exile and blood and blizzard, forged in the particular way that only impossible things are forged. Then they turned toward the tree line and walked forward together into whatever came next. What does sacrifice really mean to you, and can love truly be unconditional, even after betrayal? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. We're pushing hard to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you makes these stories possible.